and nobody seems to hear what he's hearing. The noise gets louder and louder, but the other men are ignoring him. Clearly, this character has an internal conflict. This is man against self. There's something going on inside of him. As he's hearing voices, he's hearing sounds, he's hearing something that nobody else is hearing. Characters. The characters are the people in your story. Animals can also be characters, as you find very often in fables and in fairy tales. The protagonist is the main character. The antagonist is the force or person in conflict with the main character. When I read that, I emphasized pro and ant. You can remember pro, for. The protagonist is for. That's sort of the good guy. The antagonist is against. That's usually the bad guy. A short story can, of course, have any number of characters, but since it's short, normally you have one or two main characters and perhaps a handful of background or minor characters. The characters can be as creative as you wish. They can be as weird as the man in the Edgar Allan Poe story that we just read. They can be as pitiful as that poor man freezing to death in the Jack London story we just read. But whatever they are, they must act in a realistic way. Otherwise, your story is not going to make sense to your reader. That's because characters have to have believable motivations. A motivation is their reason for doing what they do. So when you choose your characters, when you create your characters, when you invent your characters, make sure that you have them act in a way that is logical, given the kind of people they are and the story that you've woven around them. What I'd like you to do now is to identify all the characters in the paragraph in your study guide, and then come back. Now I know I've got at least two characters because I've seen the eagle and the serpent. And I have that little line there, life and death struggle between the two. Reading on a little further, I find the third character, the countryman. So this particular short story, it's actually a fable, has three characters, the eagle, the serpent, and the countryman. Now, we said earlier that your characters have to act in a believable way. And what you do is you choose the traits or the qualities that your characters will have. You can choose as many as you want, but keep in mind that you only have a certain amount of space, so normally one or two character traits will be predominant. Here are some possible character traits. Your characters could be ambitious or cruel or honest. Maybe they're lazy or they're hardworking, loyal. They could be generous or patriotic or courageous, selfish, maybe selfless, maybe shy. They can be humble and modest, kind, maybe treacherous, and maybe bold. So you're going to pick the traits that will help you develop your conflict. To find character traits, you would read a story and see how the characters act. To create your own character traits, you show by their actions what kind of people they are. Now, you've got two choices here. You can state it outright, so-and-so was greedy, or you can show through those people's actions, what kind of characters they are. What I'd like you to do now is list the characters' traits in the paragraph, then come back. This writer used both techniques. Mrs. Mignot, like many persons of active mind, dominating will, sedentary and corpulent. The writer actually states 4 of her qualities. She's active mind, she's smart, she's dominating will, she's bossy, sedentary, she doesn't like to move very much, and corpulent means heavy set. So I know her traits are she's intelligent, she's strong-willed, she doesn't like exercise very much, and she obviously likes to eat. I also know she has moral courage, because the writer said was there as a visible proof of her moral courage. So I've got 5 qualities directly stated, 5 traits. But the writer also implies some traits through her actions. And what the writer implies is that she's very proud of what she was like in her youth, that she is very almost arrogant. She throned in it. It's as though she's still sitting on a throne, that she has a certain noblesse oblige, that she feels she's a little bit better than everybody else. She has her house decorated in a very royal kind of way, as though she were living in a palace in France, when she's really living above 34th Street. So I know I can figure out from her actions that she's a very proud, very snobby woman. So the writer has directly stated some traits and then shown through actions some other traits. Continuing. The setting. Every story has a setting. The setting is the time and place where the events occur. Just as you did with character traits, you can state that setting outright, or you can have readers infer or figure it out. If you have to infer the setting, you're going to look at the character's speech, their clothing, or their means of transportation. So taking this back for a second, if the setting is stated outright, you could say in the beginning of your story, this story takes place on Pluto in the year 3050. If you don't want to state it outright, the characters might be wearing spacesuits. They might be able to fly through the air. They might not eat food. They might live only on pills or something like that. And they might have all sorts of jetpacks. And I would infer from that that it must be taking place sometime in the future. You can also use the setting to create the mood, as Edgar Allan Poe often does. He sets many of his stories in gloomy castles, in graveyard crypts, and that adds to that single effect of horror that he wants to create. The setting can be very unimportant. It might not really have much impact, or it can be extremely significant, functioning almost as a character. For example, the Jack London story that we read takes place in the Yukon. The man is freezing to death. The setting is very important, because if you set that story, for example, in Florida, it would be unlikely that anybody would freeze to death. Another example, Nathaniel Hawthorne. He set his stories largely in Puritan New England. He wrote about sin and guilt. It'd be hard to do that in another setting where sin and guilt weren't quite as pervasive. So when you create your setting, you're going to decide how that contributes to your single effect. What I'd like you to do now is to identify the setting in the paragraph, then come back. Going back to the first sentence, he has the line, very long ago. Well, that tells me that this story is set a long time ago. If I really wasn't sure of that, a few more lines down, I found gold ducats. Well, a ducat is an old-fashioned coin. So now I know the story is set in the past. Giovanni had come from the more southern region of Italy to study at the University of Padua. So I know the story is set in Italy at the University of Padua. So now I know it's a long time ago at the University of Padua. Further, I know that his room is gloomy. It's in an old edifice. An edifice is a building, so it's a gloomy room in an old building that it might have actually even been a palace at one time. And I know that it's desolate and ill-furnished. So it's empty and it doesn't have a lot of good furniture. The writer, Nathaniel Hawthorne, is using this setting to create a gloomy, sad, depressing mood. I can also tell that because Giovanni sighs heavily. The heavy sigh, the desolate, gloomy apartment tells me that this setting will be very important indeed. Now, in addition to all these other things, point of view and characters and setting and so on, every single story has a plot. A plot is the arrangement of the events in a narrative. Plots have the beginning, the middle, and the end, very much like a timeline. You arrange the events of your plot to keep the reader's interest and to convey the theme. We haven't covered theme, but we will shortly. In traditional short stories, the plot can be divided into 4 main areas. The exposition, which is the very beginning of the plot, introduces the characters, the setting, and the conflict. So when I start reading, I know who the people are, I know where the story is taking place, and I know what kind of struggle or fight I will experience. The second part is the rising action. Here's where the conflict develops, and I find out how the characters are having issues, having difficulties, having challenges that keep my interest. The climax is the highest point of the action. That's the part that makes me, I really want to read to get to the climax because I want to find out what's going to happen here. The denouement, or the resolution, it's basically the same thing. That's at the very, very end of the story where the writer ties up the loose ends. What I'd like you to do now is read the story in your study guide and find the climax. Then come back. The climax occurs when the workman seizes the axe greedily, declares that it's truly his, and figures, well, now I've got what I want. Yes, I've tricked Mercury. That's the highest point of the action. The resolution occurs, of course, when Mercury takes back the axe and the workman ends up with nothing. In addition to having characters and plot and setting and so on, all short stories also have a theme. A theme is the general meaning, the statement about life that the writer wants to convey to you. Writers use the same themes over and over again because the themes are eternal. It's how the writers develop the themes that make the story creative and interesting. So you don't have to worry about making up your own theme because, again, we tend to use the same themes over and over. Your job is to show that theme in a new way. You can state the theme outright, like a moral of a fable, or you can have